this talk is happening. And that we have a projection over there, and I'm able to share with you my thoughts on this. I am a magician, it's what I do for a living. I'm used to being sceptical about everything. Obviously, we've seen James. How many of you have come across a guy called James Randi on TV? He's a guy that kind of, he blasts people who claim to be clairvoyants and claim to be able to bend spoons. Some of you have obviously heard of Uri Geller, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, you heard of it. And Uri Geller in the 70s, obviously famously on the David Frost show, bending spoons and bending forks. And of course, all of that stuff can be replicated, and as conjurers and as a member of the Magic Circle, we can replicate all of that using fairly simple means. So, I thought we'd begin today with a bit of fun. Those of you that can stand, and those of you that feel able to stand, stand yourselves up. Oh, right, I'm going to test your... Because we don't have spectators today, everyone partakes. I want to make sure that you've all got good balance, because you need good balance for a talk like this. So I want you all to try to stand, if you can, on your right leg. Just gently lifting your left. I'm going to see, make sure that you're not very wobbly. That's very good. Oh, a bit wobbly there. Okay, that's not bad. You're struggling a bit. That's not. Oh, that's good. Okay. Feet back down. Try and stand on your left leg. You might find some of you are left-handed, and that's there you go. See, that gentleman's obviously left-handed person. Much easier for him. That's marvellous. Now one last thing. Stand with both legs together. Put one hand in the air, and the same leg in the air as your hand. Oh. Very good. Back down. The other hand in the air. The other leg in the air. That's very good. I'm going to look for the one that's the most... Actually, you seem fairly balanced now. You can relax the rest of you. See yourselves down. Apart from this lovely lady here, give her a big round of applause. What's your name? Mary. I'm going to bring this chair with me, Mary. You have fantastic balance, Mary. I'd love you just to sit yourself down here. Don't worry, it won't be for long. Okay, Mary, lovely to have you. Has it come from far today? That's marvellous. Well, a lot of people have come from just down the road. I don't think they come from any further afield for this. That's fine. And we need another chair as well, Mary. Okay. Now, what I'd like you to do, Mary, is just put your feet on there for a moment, just gently. That's marvellous. And let's just check your core strength, because everyone's got tummy muscles. And keep your legs straight. I'm just going to pull this out of the way. Just keep your legs. That's very good core strength. Give Mary a round of applause. Very good, Mary. Now, okay, Mary, what we're going to do is I'm going to put this one here. If you stand right there for me, Mary, that's marvellous. You didn't realise you were a magician's assistant today, did you, Mary? Okay. But don't worry, all is going to be well. I'm going to put these together. Yes, Mary, good. And we also need, a moment, plank of wood. Good, made from a good Irish shilling. Right, I'll put this on here. This goes here, like this. Mary, like that. That's good. And that goes across there, like that. That's right. Now, Mary, if you just come and stand here for me, my dear. Like this way. And if you just make yourself comfortable sitting yourself there. Just on top. Yes, that's great, Mary. You've done a wonderful job. That's great. Now, Mary. Wonderful. Okay, there? Great. Marvellous. Now, if you could just gently bring these legs up there and just swing yourself around. And just lie back and relax. You know what? It's one of those, it's miserable weather out there. You just get yourself comfortable. I'll put your head. Yes. Put your hands behind your head. It's going to be easier for you. There you go. You're okay there. And shuffle yourself forward a little bit. There you go. That's great. Okay there? Wonderful. That's great, Mary. Now, what we're going to do, Mary, is I want you to imagine that this part of your body, this half up here, is very heavy, and this part down here is very light. We're going to help that to happen. I've got a helium balloon here, Mary. There we are. Always good to carry a helium balloon with you when you do a talk on the Turin Shroud. I'm going to tie the helium balloon. I'm going to tie the helium balloon around here, like this. That's great, Mary. Marvellous. That goes around the wood and around your legs. Like that. And what this does is this is a counterweight, you see. This is pulling you up. That's bringing you down. And that's bringing you up. Now, I want you to imagine up here is very, very heavy, and down there is very, very light. And just relax and breathe in. Just imagine you were on Brighton Beach. That's good. Okay, relax. And this is lifting you up. This is very, very light, and that's very, very heavy. Okay, here we go. And relax. You're a wonderful job. And relax. And relax. And relax. And imagine them down here, you're very, very light, and up there, you're very, very heavy. And give Mary a massive round of applause. It's because of the helium balloon, Mary. Put that back. Just gently underneath there. There it goes. All the way over your feet. All the way there. And we just open that up like that. And we let that go up like that. And Mary, you can just get yourself up gently and give Mary a massive round of applause. So, what the hell was that all about? If you think about it, you obviously know. You say to yourself, well, is it possible that a helium balloon could really lift somebody up? Is that really possible? And you think it through. And you say to yourself, no, I don't think a helium balloon can really lift up a human body. Unless, of course, Mary is very, very, very light. Maybe secretly I chose the lightest person in the room. The person that could counteract the helium. Obviously not. And if you actually thought it through and worked it through, you'd realise, if you thought it through and worked it through, that the physics of the chairs and the physics of the board, there is a way of making that happen. If you eliminate all the possibilities and you go all the way down, eventually you'd come up with the answer and you'd realise how the illusion was done. And that's exactly what people have tried to do. See what I did there? With the Turin Shroud. They've seen this. This is a piece of cloth. It's 14 feet 3 by 3 foot 9. And it currently resides in St. John's Cathedral in Turin. I've been there. It's quite a magnificent piece. And it's very, very long. And it has a strange image going down through the middle, which doesn't look like much, and then these funny bits along the side. Actually, you go all the way there to see it, and you think, the closer you get to it, the more the image vanishes, actually. The further you have to stand further away to be able to see the thing. And you look at it and you think, well, what am I actually seeing here? You know, and as a magician, I'm very aware of the fact that our eyes play tricks on us all the time. For example, here's a chessboard, right? And a kind of green cylinder on the chessboard. Right, who says, okay, look at section A, and look at section B. I'll use my pencil. Section A, and section B, there. Who says section A is lighter than section B? Hands up. One person. You need your eyes tested, darling. It's fine. Who says section A is darker than section B? Hands up. Majority of you have said that section A is darker than section B because you're seeing a shadow being cast across section B. Fair enough? Right. Now the reality of the matter is, your eye is playing a trick on you. I know this is hard to believe, but section A is exactly the same colour as section B. They're exactly the same shade. There is no difference in the shade. Can we go back one? Section B and section A are exactly the same shade, but your eye is trying to make sense of the image to tell you that the white square is supposed to be lighter than the black square, and yet they are exactly the same. Our eyes play tricks on us all the time. Here's another one for you. There you are, Jesus on toast. Now, that's not really Jesus on toast, ladies and gentlemen. It's actually Theresa May. No, it's not. No, it's not. But all that is a burnt piece of toast. But we do this all the time, don't we? We can see the man in the moon, we can see the man in the clouds, and so on and so on and so forth. However, when we actually look at the Turin Shroud, here it is again, it's very, very clear that what we are seeing is the image of a man, 5'8", the front, and the dorsal, it's the back, right there. And it's obviously been wrapped around, or it looks like it's been wrapped around, something to that effect. And people say, well, what could account for this image? I'm sure there must be some kind of explanation that will help us to understand what that image is. And we can go back to the image. Thank you very much. That's good. That can help us to understand the image. Now, some people suggested it was created by bas-relief rubbing. So bas-relief rubbing is a bit like this, where you take something like a leaf or something like a bottle, for example, and then you cover it with a cloth or a piece of paper like this, and then you take something like a crayon, for example, and then you rub. And as you rub, all of the raised sections from underneath that are on the actual image itself get, they bleed through almost the lights and the darks and the highs and the lows. As you rub, you can actually see that image is formed as the ink or the chalk or whatever it is takes those raised sections and pronounces them more on a cloth. And they thought that this is how the Turin Shroud was made. Maybe perhaps a brass image laid flat, the cloth goes over the top, then some kind of a rubbing technique or some dabbing technique or something like that, and then you have this image of a shroud from a brass rubbing. Well, if you think that this image, the image of the Turin Shroud, is a brass rubbing or anything to that effect, you would be quite wrong. The reality of the matter is that no image, no artifact, no historical thing in all of our history has been examined as much as the Turin Shroud. Thousands and thousands and thousands of man-hours of study have gone into this thing. And in 1976, a group of people headed by John Jackson and Eric Jumper came together to see if we can go in to St. John's Cathedral, move it to the side chapel, examine this thing and see if we can work out how it's done. Try and work out the secret. So in 1978, the Vatican granted them permission, and they took with them people from the Brooke Institute of Photography. There were eminent hematologists, that is blood experts. There were pathologists, that is people who studied the cause of death. There were botanists, chemists, artists, art historians, textile experts, pollen experts, computer imaging experts. 40 of these experts in different fields all went to study the shroud. And the Vatican gave them 5 days to study this thing. They said, we'll give you 5 days. And they did not waste a single minute. While half of the team slept, the other half of the team worked. While half of the team worked, the other half of the team slept. And they did this for the entire duration of those 5 days. And they subjected the cloth to all sorts of tests, short of damaging the cloth, which they didn't do, they weren't allowed to do. They did all manner of tests on the cloth. They wanted to test to see if they could find pigments, dyes, corks, paints, binders. They wanted to test to see if the image was made by a heat mechanism, like a scorch. And so they subjected it to a UV light. And when they subjected it to a UV light, it didn't fluoresce. That told them that the image itself, even though the side sections fluoresced, where there'd been a fire, but we'll talk about that later, the actual image in the middle did not fluoresce. That told them that this was not created by a heat source. They also subjected it to infrared tests. They subjected it to microscope magnification. They subjected it to sticky samples to see if there were any pollens on the cloth. There was a very famous pollen expert there called Max Fry. There were X-ray tests done on the shroud. There was photography over every inch of the cloth by Barry Schwartz, a very eminent photographer, and a whole host of other tests. And they published their findings in 1981. And they concluded that the image on the cloth depicts in accurate detail a man 5'8", tortured and crucified in the way that the Gospels and the New Testament describe. Lots of people were crucified in history, but only one is described as being crucified in a specific, unique way because of who he was. So let's have a look at some of the details of the shroud. First and foremost, in the head wound, the head area, we see a scapula or a crown of thorns. We see puncture wounds on the head, and the puncture wounds that are on the head, traditionally when we see the crown of thorns in movies like The Passion of the Christ or some of these movies, actually we see this kind of rather delicate-looking halo of thorns around the head. Whereas in the image on the shroud, these puncture wounds, they go all the way up to the top of the head, and on the dorsal section, they come all the way down the back from the top of the head. So actually, what you're actually looking at there on the shroud, the puncture wounds suggest something more like a cap of thorns, rather than a crown of thorns. But whatever this was, he was obviously being mocked as some kind of king, whoever this person was being crucified. Now, most victims of crucifixion were not mocked as being kings. So this is a specific crucified victim who obviously they wanted to ridicule for being a king. And we all know that Jesus Christ, when he was crucified, had INRI, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Now, the whip marks on the shroud image. There are multiple puncture wounds. In fact, there are over 200 puncture wounds on the front and the back of the shroud. And these lacerations on the body, you can see in the lacerations dumbbell-type marks. Dumbbell-type marks there on the lacerations. And this is a replication, an artistic replication of what we're actually seeing, just on the back section. The man is whipped literally back and front. These specific marks are perfectly consistent with a Roman flagrum. And a Roman flagrum was a Roman whip, used in the 1st century, which they used to whip the victims. And these Roman flagrums had little dumbbell-type mechanisms on the end, which would weaken the integrity of the skin on the first whip and then puncture the skin on the second whip. And it was a pretty barbaric affair. But here's the thing, a Roman would only whip a Roman 40 times minus 1. Whereas a Roman could whip a Jew as many times as he wanted. And in this particular case, the man is severely flogged, but also crucified. Now that's very unusual because you were either flogged or crucified. Most people would never have made it through both forms of torture. So if a person was crucified, they weren't flogged. If a person was flogged, they tended not to be crucified. And in the Gospels we read that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, said, look, let's have Jesus severely flogged so that the rabble, the crowd who were vying for his death would be placated. And we could release Jesus after a severe flogging, and that would be the end of it. But we all know it all went wrong in the New Testament Gospel narratives, and that this specific person in history was both flogged, and then, because the Romans said, we're going to release him, they said, no, the Jews said crucify him. So he ended up being both flogged and crucified. Very unusual case in history. So there was also a puncture wound in the right side of the man between this specific section of the rib cage, which would have pierced the pericardium right there. And that would have had a congealing of blood and serum. And on the shroud, we see in the back section of the shroud this pool of serum, obviously dry, but this dried pool where the serum has been. And that is perfectly consistent with a Roman lance. And the actual size of the puncture wound right there on the side is consistent with this diamond shape of a Roman lance. Let's have a look at the nails in the hands. Now, interestingly, we see here on the image of the man in the shroud that the nail section right there goes through kind of the wrist, not the hand. Now that's really, really weird because that kind of contradicts 2,000 years of religious art. I mean, any of you who've seen any religious art, Grunwald's crucifixion or anything, where do the nails go? In the hands. Exactly. And yet, we know that the shroud, all people, both skeptics and believers alike, agree that we know the history of the shroud and its image from the 15th century at least, and it's well recorded. And there are bits in history that point all the way back to 325 AD in Edessa. And all experts and skeptics agree, we can be sure that we have the very clearly and reliably documented history of the shroud from 1532, an incontestable history. So at the time, these were the kind of medieval images that we would expect to see of Jesus on a cross. So why would the marks be, why would the nails be right there? Well, we now know a lot more about crucifixion than we did, obviously. And the fact of the matter is that if a nail goes through there and there, that cannot hold the weight of a person on a cross. In fact, there's only one place that can hold the weight of a person, and it goes from the heel of the hand, between the heel of the hand and the wrist, right there. Now, in the New Testament, the word for hand is cher. The word for wrist is cher. In fact, they had no word for wrist. From there to there was cher. So when it says the holes are in the cher, that could mean anything from there to there. So there is no inconsistency with the gospel accounts, and in fact, if anything, this is more consistent with what we know about crucifixion. There's also another interesting thing. Look at the fingers. You notice there are only 4 fingers on each hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Where are the thumbs? When a nail goes in through there, and the Romans use 4-inch roofing nails. When the nail goes in through there, what it actually does is it completely severs the median nerve, and the thumb snaps in. That's what actually happens. So what you're seeing here is somebody their hands are anatomically correct with the Roman way of crucifixion. The only way that a person could have actually been held on a cross. So if it was a medieval artist, he would have almost certainly put the nails in the wrong place, and he certainly wouldn't have had 4 fingers on the hand. And you don't get that in 2,000 years of religious art. So that's what makes this image so fascinating. Regarding the image itself, there it is. The team, the STURP team, Shroud of Turin research project team, found themselves baffled because the image on the shroud, so if it was a painter or something or other, then you would expect this image to seep down through the cloth. But the image on this shroud is only on the top superficial fibres of the cloth, which is really, really weird. A bit like a lily on a lily pond, just sitting on the top. And what that tells us is that there's a rapid deoxidization of the cloth, the top section there, which makes those top fibres darker than the other, and it creates this image. But it doesn't go down through the cloth. Let me give you an example here. If I were to take, let's say, a piece of paper, and I were to write the word image, I-M-A-G-E, image, like that. Any guesses what will happen now if I turn this piece of paper over? What would you see on the other side? Obviously, it's going to start bleeding. You can see it starting to bleed through, right the way through to the other side, because that's what inks, corks, paints and dyes do. But there's no bleeding in this image. No bleeding through. It's only on the very, very top superficial most fibres of the cloth. And you have this rapid deoxidization, which told the team something very important. They concluded that you're not so much seeing a dead body here in the linen cloth, but something is happening to that body. Something that caused a rapid deoxidization. Some kind of a light source is happening to the body to create this image. In fact, the reality of the matter is, if I can get this lighter going, there it goes. Put that down there. In fact, if anything, what you're actually seeing there is more like a kind of a photonegative. I can only describe it as a kind of a photonegative. And it's created through this, somehow, this rapid light source that creates this image on the cloth. Very, very weird, very unusual. And it's recorded on the cloth for all to see. There are also other strange things about this cloth, which are important to understand. Secundo Pio was asked in 1898 to take a photograph of the shroud. And when he took a photograph of the shroud, that's his, as you can see, that's his smartphone there. Right there. And when he took a photograph of the shroud, he was given the right to take a photograph of the face and a photograph of the entire body. When he took a photograph of the shroud, he went back to the dark room, and in those days you had to, any of you ever had to develop a negative, ever seen a negative? Some of us will never, some of us have, some of us haven't. In the old days, we took photographs and we took out this little thing, this little roll from Kodak, and you had all the negatives on there. And the negatives are light reverse, dark reverse. Now it was the way that it was, and that had to go into a dark room, and then the negative was developed into a photograph. Well, Secundo Pia takes this glass plate into the dark room after taking these photographs of this bizarre kind of looking image on the shroud. And he's trying to develop them. And as he's developing them, he nearly faints, because what he sees developing on this glass plate is a photographic positive on a negative glass plate. Really, really weird. He's actually staring at the face of a man, and he thought to himself, maybe for the first time, I'm actually seeing a photograph of Jesus himself. He was utterly, utterly taken aback, almost fainted in the dark room. And this told him something very important. This told him that the images as we see them on the shroud are photographic negatives that develop as positives on a negative photographic plate. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the images on the shroud are photographic negatives that develop as a positive on a negative glass plate. Well, that's pretty neat. A photographic negative on a non-photographic material such as linen before the invention of photography. Well, people say, well, this must be a trick. It must be clever sleight of hand. It must be trickery. And there must be... Secundo Pia is obviously trying to pull the wool over our eyes. This is just a clever publicity stunt. But when the Shroud of Turin research project team went there, and they actually subjected the cloth to all these tests, and I think we have an image. That's the entire body, by the way, there. That's how it looks as a photographic negative. It's really weird, isn't it? Really strange. And when they subjected the cloth to all these tests, they confirmed that it really is. What we're looking at there is a photographic negative. And when we look at the negatives, Secundo Pia wasn't lying to us. When we see the negatives, they actually develop as a positive. So, there were some people that tried to suggest that it was still a painting. This guy called Walter McCrone. There he is. He was a member of the Sturp team, but he broke away and he wrote a book. And he had this idea that the image was made up of vermilion tempura, which is a kind of a red clay, and they mix it with an egg yolk, okay, the medievals, and then they dab this thing on to create red. We've all come across some of the ways that they would the ways that they would create paint in those days. They were very much more primitive ways of creating than we use today. Acrylics and things. They were very different in the way that they produced their dyes and their corks and their binders and their paints. So he has this idea that he says this must be the work of an artist because there are traces of this red ochre on the cloth, and they're all over the cloth. But the reality of the matter is, he doesn't tell you that this paint residue is over the whole cloth, including the black bits, and everywhere in quantities too minuscule to be related to the actual image itself. And the paint, the cloth rather, was in contact with painted boxes. It was stored in painted boxes. Other people would have rubbed painted artifacts onto it for a blessing. However, Walter McCrone isn't honest enough to say that the red ochre pigments are far too minuscule to account for the image formation. However, he made a fair amount of money out of his books. Obviously, that was obviously a side issue. Now, people have been trying to say that this is fake since Bishop Darcy wrote to Pope Clement VII in 1390 calling it clever sleight of hand. So is it blood or paint? Well, aside from the paint, what about these rivulets of blood? Are they real? There are hundreds of rivulets of blood on the image, on the shroud. And unlike the image on the shroud, now this is really neat, the blood on the shroud, the blood stuff goes right through. It actually seeps through the linen, but the image doesn't. The image just stays on the top, right? So the blood seeps through, the image doesn't seep through. And when you peel away the blood of the image, imagine a bit of blood there, you peel away the blood from the image, there's no image under the blood. Can anyone guess as to what that tells us? I'll tell you what that tells us. It tells us that the blood was fresh on the cloth before the image formed around it. The blood was on the cloth first, the image went poof around the blood, and wherever the blood was, it stopped the image from forming. That's why when you remove the blood, there's no image underneath the blood. The image is just around the blood. It's a bit like trying to build your house starting with the furniture. If you were a medieval artist trying to build something like this or create something like this, you'd almost certainly put the whole image on first and put the blood on top, right? But that's not how the Turin Shroud works. The blood is on first and the image goes on top. It's very, very, very baffling. So blood expert Dr. Alan Adler did a porphyrin test, which is the stuff you find in grass, and it's also, you'll find it in your blood. They found it. He also did an immunology test, him and a separate Italian team. That also tested positive for blood. They also put it under a microscope, and this is what they got. This is it. White blood cells, red blood cells, platelets. You're looking at an actual microscopic image there from a section of the blood that was removed from the shroud. Dr. Alan Adler said, you're looking at AB positive blood. You can be about as sure that there is human blood on that shroud as you can that there is blood in your veins. And also new findings have shown a partial DNA as well. Obviously, because it's very old, we can't get a full DNA, but we can get a partial DNA. The critics said, well, hang on a second. They said blood goes black, blood goes brown. The blood on this cloth is still red. And Barry Schwartz, who I told you was the photographer on the team, said, for 17 years, he said, I refused to accept that the shroud was authentic. The last argument holding me back was related to the blood. The blood on the shroud is reddish, but blood on a cloth, even after just a few hours, should turn black or brown. He says, I had a conversation with Alan Adler, a blood chemist, on the phone, and I shared my reservation. He got upset and asked, didn't you read my paper? He had found a high content of bilirubin on the shroud, which explains why the blood on the shroud is red. When a man is beaten, he has no water, he can go into shock and the liver starts pumping out bilirubin. It makes the blood stay red forever. On top of that, this is obviously physical evidence that the man in the shroud, it's not just an image of a tortured victim, this really was a tortured victim because the blood attests to it. The bilirubin attests to the fact that the man that was wrapped in this thing was a victim of torture. There are other strange properties about the shroud. Here's another weird one. They put it into a VPA image analyzer. That's a 3D machine invented by NASA for originally looking at bodies like the moon and various things, and it can interpret the information as three-dimensional. So, for example, it can see the darker bits it recognizes as higher, and the lighter bits it recognizes as lower. And when it looks out at these planets, it can actually interpret the terrain of those planets. They put the shroud into the three-dimensional VPA analyzer, and this is what they got. A perfect three-dimensional relief of a face. Not bad for a 15th century forgery, don't you think? 15th century forgery, I better make sure it's three-dimensional, just in case they invent a three-dimensional machine that can actually interpret the three-dimensional data in about 700 years from now. And you'll notice that the cheeks are swollen from the beating. Other people have attempted to try to make copies of the shroud. They've attempted, there's a guy called Luigi Galashkelly, he's attempted to do it 2 or 3 times with red ochre. You put their attempts under the VPA analyzer and you get that. Very different. I don't know what that looks like to you, but that to me looks like a pinball machine. I don't know where the ball is, but I don't reckon it would find its way out there. Okay, let's go on. Now, it gets crazier than this because when they actually looked at this image through the VPA image analyzer, there were bumps on the eyes. And they said, why are there bumps on the eyes? Eyes don't have bumps on them, kind of round bumps. And it turns out that through a special digital imaging overlay technique, they've been able to get some very high-res images of the eyes. And they noticed that there are actually coins, Roman leptons, on the eyes of the man in the shroud. As crazy as it may seem, and again, you're probably thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, am I really seeing things? Is this just the man in the moon stuff? But you see there, you see a eye. Can you see that? You see a eye. Now, on a Roman lepton, you had Tiberiu Kaiseros. which is Tiberius Caesar, of course. But you notice on the Roman leptons, Tiberius Kaiseros, and that section UKAI is with K. Here is UCAI. Misspelling. Very, very old. It turns out that numismatists Alan Wagner and Michael Marks have since found 6 coins with this misspelling. And these coins with these misspellings were only minted by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Jerusalem, in AD 29. Now, the biggest accusation to trickery on the shroud, of course, is the alleged age. They did a carbon-14 test in 1988. How many of you remember that business of the carbon-14 test? And I remember it very well. And they said the date of the cloth was 1260 to 1390. They took a corner, they took a little bit of corner from the shroud, a little strand, that's all that they were given. And they cut this thing into 3, and they sent one to Arizona, they sent one to Zurich, and they sent one to Oxford. And all 3 teams, all 3 labs did the carbon-14 test, and they all came back 1260 to 1390. Well, that was the end of it, right? The whole world said, that's it, there's the proof we need. It's too young to be the burial cloth of Christ, it's a medical forgery. There were a couple of textile experts who refused to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And they studied that area where the strand was taken for carbon dating. And they noticed that the weave shape in the corner actually changed shape in the corner where the actual section had been taken for the carbon dating. It's as if someone had spliced something in. There's the whole shroud. You'll see here these marks here and here. They do fluoresce under UV because they're burn marks. The shroud has survived 4 fires in its time. It's as if somebody wants this thing gone. And the worst was in Chambry, France in 1532. It was in a silver reliquary, it's a silver box, and the fire was so bad that actually molten silver dripped down on this folded shroud. And luckily there was a locksmith. They managed to get a locksmith in, and they managed to remove this thing and prise it open, remove the shroud, thank goodness. But it was left with, when they undid it, you see this pattern of scorch holes where that fire had occurred. And it turns out that the corners have been repaired using a French invisible reweave technique by French nuns. Sue and Joe submitted a paper explaining that that part of the shroud used for the dating is a later repair. So it's no good using that corner section to try to understand the date of the rest of the cloth. The main body of the cloth is going to give you a different date. But it was a bad scientific way to do things. It was bad science. You know, if you're going to do science properly, you take a section from here, you take a section from there, you take a section from there, and you take a section from there. You don't take one section and cut it into 3. That's really bad science. But Ray Rogers, who was a chemist on the Stirp team, said, you know what, he was an old man when Sue Bedford and Joe Marino came up with this theory. He said, you know what, he said, that's Ray Rogers right there. He said, I can blow this full of holes. He said, this idea that the corners are a repair section. He said, and Barry Schwartz said to him, well, if you can blow it full of holes, do it. And Ray Rogers went, he had a section from the time of the testing, a small section in his laboratory, which he said, I'm going to get out, I'm going to put it under a microscope, I'm going to look at that section, because I've got a section from that corner area where the carbon dating was done. So he put that section under a microscope, and a bit like Secundopia, he almost fainted. Because he put it under the microscope, and he couldn't believe his eyes. He found dyed cotton, wound into the linen. And in that moment, he realized that the carbon dating tests of 1988 were from this corner area, which was contaminated. The French nuns had done a brilliant, brilliant illusion. They'd actually blended that thing in so perfectly that it looked like linen. It was actually cotton under the microscope. And what had happened was that had skewed the carbon dating test. Since then, Dr. Giulio Fanti has done numerous tests on the shroud, different tests on remaining pieces from the linen on the shroud, corner sections. He's a thermal mechanical engineer, he's done a Raman spectroscopy test, he's done a weight-bearing test, he's done a vanillin test, and his results suggest that the shroud is dated to the 1st century with a 96% accuracy. Why didn't we read about that in the papers? Why didn't those who did the carbon-14 test publicly apologise? There are other problems with it being a 15th century or 13th century forgery. Firstly, the pollens. There are pollens on the cloth which you only find in Israel and specifically Jerusalem. And the one that interests me the most is in the head area. There is a pollen called Bundelia tourneforti, which is a thorn thistle bush, which only blossoms in Jerusalem during the springtime. This tells us that that cloth had to have been in Jerusalem in the springtime at some point. Also, on the back of the cloth, there is calcium carbonate on the back section of the cloth. That's the underside, not the image side, the underside. And calcium carbonate is a specific kind of calcium carbonate called travertine aragonite. And this travertine aragonite is only found in the limestone tombs in Jerusalem. So at some point, this cloth had to have been in a limestone tomb in Jerusalem. Let's finally look at the hands. What you're actually seeing there is a partial X-ray. Not just there, this also blows my mind. If you look at the head section, through the digital imaging overlay technique, you can see there, look at the mouth area. What are you seeing right there on the shroud? Can you see that? Can you see that? You're looking at the teeth. The man's mouth is closed, but the teeth are showing through on the image on the shroud. This means that what we're actually seeing on the shroud is an autoradiograph. The man is producing his own light from within inside, a bit like a photocopy machine. Does that make sense? Now, whatever caused this was a light source so strong it left an impression on a non-photographic material. And the closest we've come to this in history is the atom bomb in Hiroshima. The Hiroshima shadows, I don't know if you can see them, very, very sad, but during the Second World War, when the atom bomb was set off in Hiroshima, the blast was so strong and so fast that it incinerated the victims, but it left their shadows. It left their shadows on the streets, left their shadows on the walls. In one instance, there is a guy on a horse about to whip the horse. He's on a carriage. The carriage is incinerated, the horse is incinerated, the man is incinerated, but the image sits on the wall and remains on the wall, the image of the shadow. And that's created by an intense blast of light. So, what kind of energy is required to get this image on the shroud? According to Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro, a thermal physicist who studied the shroud image, he said it needs to be very, very fast, or else it would not only have incinerated the shroud, but also have incinerated the tomb. The shutter speed had to have been 140 billionths of a second. That's faster than a picosecond. And very bright, very, very bright. How bright was it? He tells us. 34,000 billion watts make it impractical today to reproduce the entire shroud image using a single laser excimer, since this power cannot be produced by any vacuum ultraviolet light source built today. To get that image on that shroud, Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro says it requires 34 billion watts. If you want to know what that is, stand 1,000 miles from the sun and open your eyes. And you'll get it. I don't suggest you do it, by the way. It was rhetorical. So when you begin to stack it all up, you begin to think about it, and you begin to put it all together, and you say to yourself, you probably wonder why I have a toothbrush. No, you don't say that to yourself. And you say to yourself, well, what have we got here when we stack it all up? Well, first and foremost, we have this photographic, three-dimensional, negative autoradiograph on a non-photographic material such as linen on the top superficial fibres of the cloth. we also have the fact that there really is AB positive blood on that cloth. We stack that on top of the fact that there is also bilirubin on the cloth, proving that this man died a violent death. And when you stack that on top of the fact that there are pollens on the cloth, pollens that we find in Jerusalem and in Israel, and then we find the travertine aragonite only in the limestone tombs of Jerusalem, and then on top of that we have to deal with the wound marks, which are totally consistent with what we now know about crucifixion. And then we stack that on top of the fact that the coins on the eyes were minted in AD 29 by Pontius Pilate. And then we stack that on top of the fact that the date of the cloth, dated by Dr. Giulio Fanti, has now been shown to be the 1st century with a 96% accuracy. We would be flying in the face of the facts if we thought that it wasn't what it appears to be. That the best explanation, the simplest explanation, is the true explanation. That what we're actually seeing is not a resuscitation, but a resurrection power flowing through this body, changing every atom, leaving this imprint on this cloth for the whole world to see. The kind of energy that would take those 12 disciples who were scared for their lives on the night that Jesus was crucified, and turn them around 3 days later where they were absolutely convinced and willing to lose their own life for the belief that they'd actually seen this man risen from the dead and that he was the Lord of life. Now, we can do one of two things with what we've been presented today. We can either say, well, we allow the evidence to lead us wherever it will. Or you can say, don't confuse me with the facts. My mind is already made up. And this does not fit what I believe about reality. So therefore, I will go on believing what I want to believe, and I will get rid of those things that don't fit my worldview. Why do people so desperately want to disprove that this really is the burial shroud of Jesus? Because if Jesus really is risen from the dead, ladies and gentlemen, this changes everything. In fact, Buddha said, I'll show you the way. Muhammad said, I'll show you the way. Moses said, I'll show you the way. Jesus said, I am the way. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. He said, whoever comes to me, he said, I won't cast away. And I gave my life to Christ 30 years ago. And I invite you all to do the same. I believe the historical record. I believe the shroud data. As a magician, I'm very skeptical. But the more science we have, the more this seems to show again and again and again that it really is what it seems to be, and I want to follow those facts wherever they may go. I don't believe that this thing just stacks up on its own. I don't believe that helium balloons just lift people in the air. I believe there's a magician at work. And if you're real with yourselves, I think, you know that an even greater magician is not only behind the shroud, but also the entire universe. Thanks very much.